Thanks for inviting me to this meeting. This is actually a meeting I've been really curious about for a long time. And early in my career, I used to quite regularly go to the Society for Psychophysiological Research. I was always annoyed that there was another society around called SPR. It seemed very, very rude. But when I checked out what they did, I thought that's very cool. I should go to that meeting. And here's a little tip for people. If you wait long enough, they ask you. So that was very cool. So really, I am very pleased to be here, and it's a great meeting. I hope to come again in the future. So I'm going to talk about the application of the kind of methods that we've been hearing about to the prevention of suicide. But I've noticed some of the medical people have their disclosures slides, so I thought I'd put mine up. I'm a psychologist, and nobody gives me any money for anything. So that's all you need to know. Okay, so let's talk about suicide. It's really a challenging and tough problem. You can see that in that graph on your left, one of the things is we've seen many of the causes of death that we deal with in society have actually reduced dramatically as medical care and public health have improved. But suicide really hasn't. And in fact, although we do see some interesting, promising signs more recently, here you can see on the second graph there, this is sensitive, there are some countries where there's been a dramatic reduction in the suicide rate, even over the last 20 years, and it's particularly been associated with the reduction of access to means. So for instance, in Russia, the decline has largely been associated with reductions in alcohol use. In China, the reductions have been often associated with changes in agricultural chemicals that have been used in people taking attempts on their life. So one of the less sanguine aspects of this, though, is you can see that in the United States, the suicide rate is actually increasing. And this is unusual internationally. Of course, it's hard to know exactly why these things are. There's probably two factors that people talk about. One is the opioid crisis. And then the second fact is the very high rate of gun ownership, particularly domestic ownership of guns, which has been increasing over this period. And so these are two factors. And of course, there's also got to be said there's a correlation, not huge, but a correlation between those areas of the country where opioid addiction is very high and rates of domestic ownership of firearms. And so when you put intoxication and availability of firearms together, then you've got a very dangerous situation for people who are at risk. One of the things that's very interesting, though, about suicide, this is a set of pictures that perhaps some of the older folks in the room will follow. So this is from the very famous Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And despite the fact that it's kind of a feel-good, nostalgic movie, it actually involves a scene of suicide attempt, or at least intent. And so Jimmy Stewart's here, he's on the bridge, he's really at the end of his rope, and he's considering jumping and taking his own life. And what happens is that an angel appears to him at the time in the form of this funny old character, Clarence, the angel, and actually dissuades him from making the attempt, and it goes on. Things look up from there. But the point that I'm trying to emphasise here is that suicide is actually a highly disruptable set of behaviours. There is a small group of people who are very intent on taking their own lives and will continue to do so virtually no matter what, but that's a minority. The majority of people who make a suicide attempt, there's actually about a 10 to 15 minute period of high risk for enacting the behaviour. And if that behaviour is disrupted, you can actually prevent the behaviour from occurring. So, for example, there are some public health interventions like putting medicines into blister packs rather than into bottles, which actually reduce suicide because simply the act of having to get the medication out of the blister pack, which takes more time, is enough to interrupt the suicidal act. If you do have a gun, and I recommend that you don't have a gun in your home, but if you do, then keeping the ammunition away from the gun will in fact reduce rates of suicide because simply the act of having to go to two places to load the gun will disrupt the behaviour. So we know that if you can act at the right time, If you can interrupt the behaviour at the time of highest intention and get the person through that 10 to 15 minute period to the other side, then you will be able to, in many cases, potentially save a life. However, our data on this, on that time, on that high risk period of time is very poor. This is a graph that's based on a really excellent paper that came out in Psychological Bulletin a few years ago, reviewing all the things that we know about prediction of suicide. And one of the things that is very clear from this is that we have virtually no empirical data that addresses this period of time. So you can see that little slither of red there is the amount of studies that we have that address prediction within 1 month. And so the rest of these are all about prediction at much more distal periods of time. Now, recently there's been a few interesting studies come out that have started to wrestle with this problem, but of course it is a tricky problem. So suicide is a low frequency event, thankfully, at least in sort of public health terms. And so there's a few studies that have tried to get a sense of what's going on immediately before the suicide. So this is a study, a really terrific study that was done with a group of people who'd attempted suicide and survived. And what it was a timeline follow back, and they asked them to recall what their affect had been in the hours leading up to the suicide attempt. And so you can see that there's a number of psychological factors here: feelings of dissatisfaction, being alone, feelings of hostility, feelings of being scared, that really rose dramatically in the hours before the suicide attempt. And so this is a pretty compelling case that emotional distress is really an important part of this lead up to the period of the attempt. However, obviously there's a lot of problems with this methodology. I mean, it's a great paper and I'm glad they published it, it's very valuable data, but if you're asking someone who's just attempted suicide what happened prior to it, there's going to be a very powerful narrative that the person develops around that, and it's going to involve, I was feeling pretty bad. And so, knowing a little bit more about that from a more prospective point of view is really one of the challenges. And we even know that in highly at-risk groups, this suicidal phenomena varies dramatically over time. So this is a study where they were looking at people who had a previous attempt. I think that's the group that we're looking at here, and they were monitoring suicidal thoughts over time. Suicidal ideation, and you can just see these are each panel here is an individual person, and you can see that the dramatic variability that you see over time in suicidal ideation. These are phenomena that have been evaluated every few hours. So it's a very dynamic set of phenomena as well. And of course, this leads us into the general problem that we have in mental health, is that our modes of assessment really haven't changed that much for a long time. Some might say even 100 years, especially in the sense that we are still primarily relying on self-report. Now, I'm not against self-report. I want to make that clear. Phenomenology, the person's experience, is a key part of what we want to understand in mental health. But we also know that there are certain problems with self-report data. In every area where we have the ability to collect both objective indices and self-report indices of the same behaviour, we find that the self-report is not telling us the whole picture. And in fact, in some cases, it's almost uncorrelated. So there are areas such as sexual behaviour. So there's some studies on condom use where, for example, where there's comparisons of objective measures of condom use and self-report, we see low correlations. We've already heard from Fiona about sleep, and we know in sleep there's often, we have objective methods and subjective methods, and they tend to correlate a little bit, but not a lot, and sometimes not at all. Substance use, where we can use things like urine screens and so forth to give an objective measure, and we compare that to self-report. And yet in mental health, we really rely on self-report almost exclusively with nothing else. And we've been doing this for a very long time, and so we've got part of the picture, an important part of the picture, but we don't have the whole thing. And so this is where we come to our, you can see my nostalgic inclinations in the slides here. I know there's a bunch of young people here just going like, what the hell? Maxwell Smart? Who's that guy? Anyway, but yeah, that's Maxwell Smart with his famous shoe phone from the 1960s. It was considered a really forward-looking piece of technology there. But this is why the kinds of methods we've been hearing about, this capacity to collect data passively and continuously with low participant burden, is really quite a game changer. It's data we haven't had before. So it has these advantages. It's objective, it's unobtrusive, which means it has low burden. It also means that we can start to wrestle with this question of idiographic versus normative description. We can actually have individualised baselines. Something that might be very normal for me might be very abnormal for someone else. And so just knowing that we're both doing this particular behaviour, let's say listening to heavy metal music or something like that, I might do it all the time. It's no big deal for me. But for someone else, it might be a very dramatic change in their mood that's reflecting. But the only way we can know that if we have very intensive within subjects data. Obviously, it's collected in real time, which is important for our application here, and it's potentially highly scalable, as we've been heard as well. And so I'm really making points that have already been made, but the point is that the way in which people, and particularly young people, which is my area of interest in adolescence, are using their phones, that just through their naturalistic interaction with smartphones, they're automatically quantifying a series of behaviours that we already know from extensive literature associated with mental health. So language, circadian rhythms, autonomic physiology, we've heard about that in Holly's talk. Patterns of geographic movement, acoustic voice quality, facial expressions, social interactions, physical activity, sleep. This is all getting quantified without asking a single question. And there's a large literature on each of those topics telling us that it's associated with mental health. So now I want to focus in on teenagers, and because my particular interest in is risk for suicide in teenagers, and of course the phone is a particular kind of phenomena for teenagers that's different for people who are of a different age or of a different age cohort. So I use my phone primarily to say I'm running late, what's the football score, what's the weather, I use these very perfunctory things. My 18-year-old daughter uses the phone to fall in love and to have arguments and to, and to flirt and to, do all these things that are incredibly personally important and engaging. It's a device of social connection and social communication much more profoundly for someone of that age than it is for someone of my age, and perhaps of my cohort. So we'll see what, that may be a cohort thing, it may be an age thing, it may be a bit of both. So anyway, so you can see this is from the Common Sense Media report that came out just about a year ago. There's obviously a dramatic increase in the number of young people, even between 2012, 2018, who own a smartphone, who are using social media. And you can also see other patterns, like the fact that there's a dramatic decrease of the number of young people who will say that Facebook is their favourite social media site. And this points out to a very important thing, that young people's usage, as we were talking about before, about devices changing all the time, the way in which young people are using phones is incredibly dynamic. They're on new platforms, new programs, new methods of communication all the time. So we need to know that. It's another piece of data, very similar, just making the point that 45% of teens say they're online almost constantly. And if you add that to those who are several times a day, you've got about 90% of teenagers who are this is within the United States. And here's another interesting one, their preferred method of communication. This is a change over a 6-year period, a significant decrease in the number of people who say my preferred method of communication is in person, and an increase in social media and video chatting in particular as methods of communication. So the way in which young people are communicating is changing. All right. So we've developed some software which is similar to some other things you've heard about today. We call it EARS. The EARS stands for Early Effortless Assessment of Risk States. But it's also a good image because we're listening. And we collect a lot of different streams of data, and I guess because of our interest in young people and teenagers, there's been a particular emphasis in this tool on collecting not just the form of people's interactions, but also the content. Now that does mean we can talk a little bit about ethics in a minute, and obviously we're collecting much more intrusive data here, but because it's so psychologically rich, and so personally involving. And when we're interested in phenomena like suicide, which do have these aspects of emotional distress and social disconnection as key predictors, we really want to look at things like the language. So we collect all the text that people type in the keyboard. And because we're working at the level of the keyboard, it doesn't matter what app they're in. We collect it across every app. And we also know which app they're putting the data into. We collect acoustic voice samples, like we heard from Holly. They're doing that as well. We collect facial expressions in selfies and other. So we're really interested in not just what's happening, but how often people are using the phone, but what the patterns of communication are. I can go into this in more detail in the discussion period. The brief message here is that you get more data out of Android than you do out of Apple. That's why I own an Apple phone, because they're more secure, but it's why we like working with Android, because they're easier to hack. And so we do get, for example, voice we can't get in Apple at the moment. We collect it naturalistically in phone calls, and so forth. So let's get back to suicide. Now, so in terms of thinking about how we would bring this kind of tool to the problem of suicide, we actually have a grant at the moment, a Euro 1 grant that we're currently doing. And when we set up the thinking around this grant, we wanted to think about how we could not only use, sort of atheoretical approaches like machine learning and so forth, but also use sort of theory-driven approaches and interpretable models for this. And so we thought about some theories. So there, one theory of risk for suicide is the what's called the psychache theory, that it's a response to intense and unbearable psychological distress. The person just can't stand it, feeling this way anymore. They want to get away from their own set of experiences. And so therefore we're interested in quantifying emotional distress, and we have many sensors that can pick that up. Acoustic voice, language, you get a very good sense of emotional distress. Another theory is Thomas Joiner's interpersonal theory of suicide, which very much emphasises social burdensomeness or social disconnection so a very compelling, when you're working clinically with people who are at risk for suicide, a very compelling statement that often connotes very strong risk is, others would be better off without me. Right? If someone says that and they've got other risk factors, that's a very high risk situation you're dealing with there. So the belief that you're burdensome to others or that others don't care. So we're looking for that in terms of patterns of online communication, experiences of bullying, social rejection, and also social withdrawal. And then finally, there are certain diathesis stress models suggesting that there are some biological diatheses that also promote risk for suicide, and one that we can measure and that Fiona's already talked about is sleep. And there's an extensive literature showing that sleep disturbance and sleep disruption is a common feature prior to suicide attempts and periods of serious suicide ideation. So, and once again, we can measure that through the phone using both the actographs, the patterns of phone use, the light sensor, the charging time. There's a lot of things you can get from the phone, and we've worked on some algorithms to estimate time in bed and insomnia using those, particularly with young people who often use their phone right until the time they go to sleep, and it's the first thing they look at in the morning. So the study is with 200 high-risk youth discharged from treatment, from psychiatric treatment. We're following them for 6 months. They get major assessments at 1 month, 3 months and 6 months, which are associated with periods of intensive EMA, measurements of mood and social context. But we've discovered that young people, and actually older people as well, won't tolerate that sort of EMA for much longer than a week. This is fairly intensive. They're getting eight pings a day. And so we just do it for these little bursts, and we promise them that they won't be bugged in between times. But of course, in between times, we're collecting the mobile sensing data. We also check in with them every week with respect to their suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviours, and if there is a risk at that point that reaches a threshold, there's a clinical response that's generated by that. So, to give you a look at something, we're still early days, and I don't have. Invite me back again, and I'll tell you about the results of the study. We're just in our first year of a 4-year study, but we've got a number of participants in. Just to show you what some of the data looks like, it's pretty interesting. This is some data. Each column here is a different person, and this is looking at the number of text messages they send on each day of the week. And you can see that there's enormous variability, but we've also got some remarkable phenomena such as this. My cursor's not working, but you can see the very tall one. There's one person in there who sent 1,000 text messages in a day. And I asked my daughter, who, as I've said, is 18, do you think that's plausible that someone would send 1,000 text messages in a day? And she was like, yeah. Like, that's totally plausible. So anyway, so I was like, okay. Anyway, but you can see that there's a lot of individual difference there as well. This is some data showing you that just look at the top lines probably in the second one. This is looking at the PHQ-9, the depression rating scale. The second one is ratings of sadness from the EMA. You can see that the sentiment, the language sentiment, so this is looking at processing the language that people are typing in, correlates pretty highly with those measures. And it also not just correlates from the baseline, but it correlates from day to day. The day-to-day variation in those moods also is correlated with the day-to-day variation in the kind of language people are putting in. Another thing that comes out as this is with just a subset of the sample, is that the amount of time you spend at home, so which we get from the GPS data. So the more time you spend at home, on average, statistically, the more likely you are to be experiencing depression. Here's some of the language that we get from people looking at the keyboard entry. It exemplifies an interesting issue. If you look at the positive language, the fourth word down is holy. But you can see that on the other side we've got words like shit and fuck, and so it's likely that the word holy is really a bigram associated with holy shit and holy fuck. So this, but it exemplifies an important methodological issue that a lot of the analysis of language we do is a so-called what we call a bag of words approach, where you throw all the words in a bag and you rate each one. And of course, language, as you would expect, is very sophisticated, and you really need to start looking at. So this is a very simple analysis. We're hoping to use much more advanced NLP, natural language processing techniques, such as word embeddings, and there's methods called word to vector, and so there's a lot of action happening in this space at the moment, which will help us to get some greater detail on that. We also monitor what music they're listening to on the phone, and Spotify has a fantastic API where you can rate the emotional quality of each song on about 20 different dimensions, which is what they use for their recommendation engine to tell you what kind of music you would like. But that's publicly available, and so we can look at the affective tone of the music people are listening to. You can actually even do analyses of the lyrics of the music that people are listening to. Here's some examples of sleep, of estimates of sleep based on actigraphy. So you can see there are periods of at least lack of movement of the phone. So this is the phone. This isn't a wrist actigraph. This is just the phone. And we've got an algorithm which we think is like Fiona said, we know when people are awake. Sorry, let me put it this way. We have certain data that tell us that people are definitely awake, but it's a rough estimate of, you can certainly have these times when it's not very good at estimating wake time in bed, but you can get a pretty good estimate of circadian phase and so forth. And then of course GPS data, that's what that looks like. So this is, but you can see one of the other interesting things about GPS data is it's incredibly identifiable. You can see where this person lives. This isn't a real participant, by the way. But you can tell where someone lives, you can tell where they're sleeping. It's really quite sensitive data to have. Anyway, our ultimate goal here, and this is where the prevention part comes in, is to have something that works a little bit like this, where we start with the user, the phone, and there's some kind of, we collect, the phone uploads the data, we use Amazon Web Services, and that you're linking that data with with databases so that you can know things like, for example, how much time are they spending near point of sale of alcohol? Are they, there are suicide hotspots in most communities that people know about, the police and so forth, and so you can identify those, and it's not like these are any one of these things is definitive, but it's all tweaking the model. and telling you about, so if you've got someone who looks like they're intoxicated and it looks like that they're near a suicide hotspot and you see a certain pattern in the language, and you know, as you get these, and this is where we do need the methods like machine learning, for example. But the point is that over here, where it's really annoying me, I don't have a pointer, but kind of that's the bit we haven't worked out, right? The prediction part. That's what we're working on now. But if we can solve it, then the clinical response is actually pretty tractable. So the prediction is the difficult bit, but then you've got these different methods. You can push nudges back to the user about how they're about actions that they could take. You can thank you. You can ask people, especially if they're engaged clinically, you can ask people about who would they like to have alerted automatically if there were certain situations that occurred, friends, family, clinical services and so forth. And of course, the most dramatic response is the one where actual clinical services are alerted and maybe mobile assessment and treatment teams are sent out to the person's home. Now, this is an interesting issue because this obviously, as you may know, Facebook has some artificial intelligence that is designed to detect suicide risk on their platform. And at the moment, it triggers that last response. And of course, it does so with very poor specificity. And so we've got a real issue to think through there, because if you are taking limited public resources for that kind of response and sending them out to a lot of people who really don't need it, then what is the cost for the other people who may need that resource over time? So anyway, I won't go on about that too much, but I just want to emphasise that this is the importance of having kind of some kind of clinical relationship with the high-risk person in the loop. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to zip through a few slides. Let me talk about ethics. There's a lot to say about this, and actually we have a paper on this. I'll tell you at the end. It's just been published in the Journal of Affective Disorders. So if you want to read a bit more deeply, the paper's there. I'll show you the reference at the end. Knowledge is power, but the question is always who is empowered by the knowledge that we're creating, and I think that that's kind of the main ethical issue to think about. And particularly in technology, we're very used to people using our data not to empower us, but to empower themselves in some ways. And the main way, of course, data is used from our electronic devices is to target us with advertising. That's the number one purpose with all that data is being used for at the moment. Far and away for anything else. My argument is, and so of course some people would say, quite rightly, that we need to control that usage of the data. But from the point of view of the psychological scientist and the prevention person, we're also saying there's a treasure trove of human behaviour data here that we've never had before. And is there something we can do with it that would be beneficial? So I think the first thing is to think about who is the beneficial, and the short answer to how to do this stuff ethically is just do it ethically. And what I mean by that is like the issues of the fundamental issues that we have to address in our research projects are the same here as they are in other places. Informed consent, the ability of the person to control and make decisions about what happens with their data, the ability of the person to know exactly what's happening with their data and what won't happen with their data, the ability of the person to withdraw at any time with no penalty, and that's easy, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that there's been an analysis of the benefits and the burdens of the thing, and so I think short answer is that if we just do what we do rigorously with our research projects now and apply it to this kind of data, you can actually solve most of the problems. But the problem is where so many people in this space are not doing that. Anyway, so I'll finally just finish with this. I do think that short-term prediction of suicide is going to be a hard problem. So my cartoon here says, when a user takes a photo, this is the person bossing the computer scientist around, the app should check whether they're in a national park, and the computer says, that's easy, a GIS lookup, give me a few hours. Like, it's a totally solvable problem. And then the boss asks for a second thing, which to them seems almost like the same sort of problem. Oh, and check whether the photo is a photo of a bird. do that as well. And the person says, well, I'll need a research team in 5 years. So some problems that sound similar are actually very difficult, and we really are dealing with a tough problem here. I don't think it's going to be simple to crack. But the opportunity to actually break through and provide a way of predicting these periods of high risk is really tantalising, and it's worth trying. Okay, like I said, there's the paper, Journal of Affective Disorders, if you want to read more, and we can also talk after the break, after lunch. Thank you.